All right, good afternoon. I think we'll go ahead and get started today. My name is John Kenyon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature Organization, and we are the group that produces the Iowa City Book Festival each year. So thank you very much for coming out to one of the first events of this year's festival. This year's festival is unique in part because of the celebration that we're doing this year of the International Writing Program's 50th anniversary. We have partnered with the IWP for many years on panel discussions that are typically held on Fridays and Saturdays of the festival. But this year we have really expanded the IWP's footprint on our schedule and have events Monday through Saturday of the festival with IWP participants as well as some of their distinguished guests. And we had Tim Parks reading last night at Prairie Lights. Hopefully many of you were able to make that. It was a wonderful reading and a great way to get our week started off. And now we move into the second of those events with this panel discussion. I did want to bring your attention to the program. Hopefully everybody has a copy of this and has had one that is well marked with all of the things you'd like to do over the course of the week. If not, there is a stack over here on the shelf as well as on a table outside the door that you can pick up when you leave. So the Book Festival and the partnership with the IWP has really been cemented by the presence of Christopher Merrill. Chris was the person that really spearheaded Iowa City's effort to become the third city of literature in the world. And so we are very appreciative of Chris and his efforts to make that happen. And he has been a friend of our organization from the very beginning. And so now I'd like to ask Chris to come up and introduce our panel. Thank you.
Thank you. I should say that we wouldn't have a City of Literature if not for the expert leadership of John Kenyon, who makes it happen. I was happy to play a role in bringing us to that, and when we got the designation and I said to the mayor, well, now it's your baby, that wasn't exactly true. It became a case that we had to work together, and I'm so glad that John has taken on the leadership and caused the City of Literature to work in every possible way. This is the first of 4 panels that we'll be hosting on here in the Iowa City Public Library, and it is fitting that we would address the issue of world literature today with some returning alumni and some of our distinguished guests. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about them. You have their bios on your handout, but for our television audience, just to let you know who we have here, Tim Parks from London and from Italy, who, as John said, gave a dazzling reading last night, is the author of 18 novels, innumerable translations, books of nonfiction, and and essays, and a blog for the New York Review of Books. Sitting next to him, it's such a pleasure to welcome back Lorna Goodison, who is the Poet Laureate of Jamaica. She was in the IWP in 1983. Wow, this is so thrilling. She's one of the most celebrated living Caribbean writers who's been honored in everywhere. And Lorna, we're glad you're back. Sitting next to her is Yvonne Owuor from Kenya, who was in the program originally in 2005 and has returned as part of a collaboration with Grinnell College. She's the author of a novel called Dust, which was changed everybody's way of thinking about the world. Sitting next to her is Jeremy Tang, who is our most recent alum to be coming back. Jeremy started out as an actor. He's a fiction writer, translator, and playwright, and his first novel, State of Emergency, came out just this year. And finally, next to him, Peter Nazareth, who, along with his wife, Mary, have worked for the IWP. This is their 40th year of providing guidance. Mary is our housing administrator. They are also the repository of all the great stories about the IWP, and we're always hoping we'll hear some of them as the days go on. And I say to the writers on the first day of orientation, remember, Peter and Mary, know everything and remember everything. And the wiser of the writers find ways to wheedle those stories out of them. Our customary way of doing these panels is you'll see on your seats index cards with pencils. Jot down questions. We'll retrieve them at the end of the writers' presentations, and then we'll field questions. So welcome to the 50th anniversary celebration of the IWP. And I'll turn it over to Tim.
Many thanks. I have the honor and pleasure of being the moderator for this, so I won't be talking a very great deal, but I do want just to try and frame the discussion right from the beginning with nothing more than 3 or 4 quotations from various moments in the past. So I'm going to start by reading you this quotation here. Perhaps the panel can twist their necks around, I don't know. In general, you could say that the tendency of the modern spirit is to reduce the whole world to one nation and all nations to a single person. No people now wear their own traditional dress, and rather than being national, fashion is European or international. Even language is becoming the same for everyone, thanks to the widespread propagation of French. Something I don't object to when it comes to usefulness, but very much so in terms of aesthetics. Well, who was it who said this? Giacomo Leopardi, July 3rd, 1820, in his diary. So we notice a couple of things, that the trend towards one world predates English by quite a margin, quite a few, certainly 100 years and more. Leopardi says, I don't object to this when it comes to usefulness, and the usefulness of a lingua franca is obvious, but very much so in terms of aesthetics. What does he mean exactly very much so in terms of aesthetics? Let me give you another quotation from the same country. What a bore when we're all speaking in Milanese and somebody from Florence or Rome or Naples comes into the room. Switching to Italian, the fun goes out of the conversation. You tell me if we now have the same readiness and confidence in the words we choose. You tell me if we don't have to use generic and approximate words where before the special word was ready. We have to fall back on a paraphrase where before we just had to name things. So this is Italy about 10 years after the previous quotation. Obviously, Italy was split into a number of languages or dialects of Italian. And in fact, in 1861, when the country would be united, only 5% was speaking Tuscan, which was to become the national language. What a bore when we have to speak the common language. The fun goes out of the conversation. Yet Alessandro Manzoni, who wrote The Betrothed, I Promessi Sposi, we remember he wrote it first in a Milanese version of Italian and then rewrote it twice in Tuscan Italian to sell it to the nation. And it was one of the first great big bestsellers in Italy. And he made his fortune for the rest of his life with this one great book. So the usefulness of Italian to him was obvious, but it did take some of the fun out of it, as it were. I'm going to throw 3 or 4 other little things at you, just to get this kind of framework in which perhaps our discussion can go on. Here is an intriguing quotation from the Nobel Prize winner Thomas Tranströmer. We must believe in poetry translation if we want to believe in world literature. So we've got a must and we've got a want. If we want to believe in world literature, do we? Well, probably yes. And if we do, we must believe in poetry translation. But that's hard. You can feel that Tranströmer feels it's actually quite hard to believe in poetry translation. So there's a very nice tension set up, I think, there. And obviously the same tension that's going on in the previous 2 quotations. Here is the kind of comment that one reads in reviews, discussions, journals, magazines, particularly conferences for translators, seminars, where translators who are obviously notoriously underpaid have to compensate by imagining that they're involved in a huge benevolent operation. So reading works by Korean writers, this is Daniel Han, who is himself a very fine translator from a number of languages, but also tells me that he does 100 translation and presentation events a year, which is an enormous number. Reading works by Korean writers, I've imaginatively inhabited dozens of varied Korean lives. Such empathy with people in distant places is good for the soul. It makes racism more difficult. It makes mean-spirited negligence more difficult. It makes selfishness more difficult. So in this view, literature is about empathy. Somebody could dispute that, perhaps. And it makes us good. Which is of course good. We might disagree with that. And if we wanted to be really cruel and disagree with that, we could ask these last two questions, with which I'm going to close this PowerPoint. Which were the Western countries then publishing most translated novels in the 1930s as Europe, alas, moved towards that terrible war? And the answer is Italy and Germany. By far the two countries which produced a huge amount of foreign literature. Italy was partly the reason is there in what I said before, that Italy, having only 5% of its people speaking the national language in 1861, the government, as part of its education program to get everybody speaking Italian, actually encouraged translation into Italian of foreign texts, because the text would be in a neutral Tuscan Italian. So texts from all over Europe particularly, but also from further afield, America particularly, were translated into standard Italian. There's something rather charming about this when one sees early translations of Dickens, who was engaged in exactly the opposite operation, which was bringing into standard English all the dialects of various parts of England and above all the South. So you see Dickens with all his many voices being pulled into a very straitjacketed Italian in a country which is full of other voices, as it were. Those were the Western countries publishing the most translated novels in the 1930s, and the ones publishing the fewest, well, we know, don't we? Britain and the USA. So there you go. Any perhaps relation to political engagement then might be out of place. So much for my introduction. I'm now going to ask, we're going to go in an absolutely dull order from here to there, and ask the members of our panel to say what they feel about this, and then we'll discuss it amongst ourselves. Okay. So, I can perhaps turn this off now.
Would that be me? Good morning. Is that okay? Okay. I've waited a long time to come back to do this, so I'm just going to not pay attention to what you just said for 1 minute.
That's fine.
Absolutely fine. It was wonderful, but I just would like to, I've waited a long time to come back to do this. I'd just like to read this poem, the first poem I wrote when I came here 35 years ago in the salubrious, wonderful Mayflower. It's called Keith Jarrett Rainmaker, and see, it's working. Piano man, my roots are African. I dwell in the center of the sun. I am used to its warmth, I am used to its heat, I am seared by its vengeance. It has a vengeful streak. So my prayers are usually for rain. My people are farmers and artists, and sometimes the lines blur. So a painting becomes a December of sorrel, or a carving heaps like a yam hill, or a song of redemption rings like the petals of resurrection lilies. All these require rain. So this Sunday, when my walk misses my son's balance on my hips, I'll be all right if you pull down for me waterfalls of rain. I never thought a piano could divine, but I'm hearing you this morning, and right on time, it's drizzling now. I will open the curtains and watch the lightning conduct your hands. Thank you, Iowa City, for that poem. Just a few thoughts about the subject at hand. For a long time, world literature was lopsided, in that the inhabitants of places conquered by great imperial powers like Britain were taught that literature was written elsewhere, mostly by Europeans and sometimes the odd Russian. But as Thomas Macaulay said, and here, sir, I give you my favorite quote about world literature. Thomas Macaulay said, "A single shelf of a good European library is worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia." That's what he said. Well, Mr. M would probably be very alarmed to hear that Rumi is the best-selling poet in the United States today. And when he wrote those words, he didn't know that Rabindranath Tagore would go on to become the first non-European to win a Nobel Prize for Literature. And I mention these two poets because both of them have had enormous impact on my own work and my own ideas about poetry. Rumi, whose work I first encountered right here in Iowa City in 1983. And Rabindranath Tagore, whose gorgeous Gitanjali I found when I worked at my first job as a bookmobile librarian in Jamaica. Now, both of these poets draw deeply from their local culture, and both are adepts of the spiritual, who, as a character in a story by V.S. Naipaul says, write poems that sing to all humanity. Now, if this sounds like I'm about to take off on a diatribe about post-colonial literature, I want to assure you that I'm not. My students cured me of that. They just said enough for the post-colonial and they're pushing back Lorna. But anyway, I'm trying to move past post-colonial. Me personally, I'm really looking forward to the day when post-colonial ends and something else can be made manifest. But I want to go back to where I started. Generations of people, like what used to be called people from the British West Indies, were taught that real literature was not produced locally. And that kind of writing would have no appeal to international audiences. So we were taught, for example, that the poems of Rabbie Burns, written in deep Scottish dialect, was great poetry, great literature. But that the poems of Louise Bennett, who wrote in Jamaican dialect, were degrading the English language. And by writing in such a language, she was bringing about, if not the collapse of Western society, certainly West Indian society. But one of the happier results of that insult to local literature was that there were generations of West Indian writers who were entirely comfortable with the great books in that good European library that Mr. Macaulay referenced. Writers like my dear, dear friend, Nobel laureate Derek Walcott, who repeatedly defended and emphasized his love for what he called his canon, even as he produced some of the greatest poems written in modern times, inspired by and drawing upon local Caribbean culture. So thanks to a number of gifted writers, including Mr. Walcott, the world has come to accept that great writing can and is done and comes from places like the Caribbean. I believe that here I should hazard a guess as to exactly what has caused this interest in world literature. I'm trying to pay attention to what I was told to do now. Time, maybe, just time. The tireless efforts of a few stubborn independent publishers, and certainly before I go on to that, the extraordinary effort of translators. But I just want to talk very briefly about the independent publisher like John LaRose in Britain, who started the New Beacon Books publishing house in London to publish the works of African, Black, British, Caribbean, Asian, and African American writers who were, as we say in Jamaica, routinely less counted by mainstream publishers. New Beacon also put on something called the Radical Black and Third World Book Fair, and it doesn't sound as dread as that is, but it was an incredibly successful series of events, this huge book fair put on in the middle of London, and writers from every single part of the world came to it, and all these independent publishers showed up, and it managed to convince a lot of mainstream publishers that, in fact, they could maybe make money off that kind of world writing. And that really changed the game, in so much that they don't put it on anymore, but they had to put it on for it to happen. I think the works of Hakim Madhubuti, Third World Press in Chicago here, whom I also met in Iowa City, had something to do with that broadening and that, culturing, bringing attention to world literature. But lastly, I believe more than ever, I really came here for this one thing mostly, to just say thank you. to the Iowa International Writing Program. I think it has done more for more world literature than almost any other organization in the world. And it would probably take Malcolm Gladwell to figure out just how many students were infected with a love of world literature through their exposure to this program. People went on to become professors, publishers, journalists, agents, literary critics, etc., who went on to spread the gospel of love for the works of writers from the wider world, most of whom came for the first time to the United States of America right here. So I really, really want to thank Nee Walling and Paul Engel and all the people, and of course Peter and Mary, the mother and father of the program, and everybody who really put this program, and just say thank you from the bottom of my heart. I came here with one book, and this is my collected poems.
Okay. I couldn't have put it better, but just so that my voice is in this, congratulations to the IWP on its 50th year milestone. Here's to infinite number of New Years. I am a great beneficiary of this experience. I came here not even able to call myself a writer, and I return with, yes, as a writer. This is my official return to Iowa as a writer. Before that, I felt like an imposter who managed to secure a holiday in the United States at somebody else's expense.
Good girl.
I'll keep you that honesty. Now, I kind of titled this, World Word and Englishes. I heard that the term world literature popped out of the mouth of Goethe, a neologism, Weltliteratur, recorded by his personal secretary, Eckermann, in a conversation where Goethe expressed his profound surprise at the profundity of his encounter with Chinese text that had been translated into German. And in his shock, perhaps, he exclaimed, "National literature is an unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand, and everyone must strive to hasten its approach." And its approach has been hastened by, I suppose, by the pragmatism of a world in flux, struggling to make meaning of the many currents of and manifestations of what is called globalization, but more practically to make money out of the opportunity afforded by the confluence of this globalization and the human desire for story. Institutions that mediate, curate, select, translate, and decree texts that populate the category of world literature are entrenched, affirmed, desired. We look forward to the choices that the Committee of the Booker Prize and the Committee of the Nobel Prize of Literature will make. And yet such categorizing also intersects the current blurring and dissolution of imagined human identities and cultural constructs. The world has indeed become a strange land. Anyway, nothing is familiar or guaranteed, so that it is with no sense of irony that the United Kingdom celebrated its win of the 2017 Nobel Prize for Literature through Kazuo Ishiguro, an Englishman. And as an aside, I had a bet with myself when the announcement was made. I wondered how many hours it would take before the adjective inscrutable would be juxtaposed with his name. It took 12. See how this world literature thing, its writer's culture, identity, and canon is. I was asking one of my writer colleagues what to do with a topic that's as large as the universe, that might head off in any direction and pick demons along the way. He counseled me to start with a quotation and end with a quotation, and then work with 3 or 4 headings in between. So, the quotation. It's by Professor Vilashini Kopan from her Ethics of World Literature. World literature, she says, is not an ontology, but an epistemology. Not a known, but a knowing. Apart from the fact that Coupan's words ooze profundity, they do propose a stimulus to the possibility of world literature, as using world literature as a humus from which, and the lens through which to reframe and interrogate the so many ideas and ways of thinking, especially of story and the word, some of which have acquired since the sheen of dogma. I will subvert my colleague's advice by offering another quotation, a prelude to actually my abiding point. From the poet, mystic John O'Donoghue, whose works I love, particularly because he writes as my late grandmother would have spoken. He in Irish English, she in Owuor. He says, "It is strange to be here. The mystery never leaves you alone. A world lives within you. No one else can bring you news of this inner world." To paraphrase, it is indeed strange to be here in this world living. Who can tell for certain what all this is? Story for many, and if I may get personal, for me, is one of the ways in which I navigate this world. It is my map. It is my template that through which I look into this existence. And I know I'm not alone in being constantly haunted by the question of what it means to be human here and now, what it means to inhabit the world, the spaces we pass through, what it means to struggle to see self and meaning in lives lived here and elsewhere. I am indebted to the alchemists of so many worlds who use art forms to shed a sliver of light on the possible answers, whether absurd or sublime. I am not an academician, so my questions are simple and echo my desire. Is this a story that sings to my soul? In that, does it reveal a twist in the plot of what it means to be human? If it does, in whatever language it chooses to reveal itself, that suffices for me. I do not understand these classifications or categories, nor frankly, do I care. So, and therefore, a post-colonial, and just to make it clear, I place post-colonial in stiff and unyielding sarcastic quotation marks. Anyway, this post-colonial child in Nairobi picks up Lord of the Rings from her father's bookshelf, a shelf that also contains the poetry of Rabindranath Tagore and Gunter Grass. Well, this child enters Tolkien's world through the English that she has grown up with as one of her first languages by fate, design, and history, into which she has been born. And in the reading of The Lord of the Rings, comes to believe in the ability of hobbits to rage against orcs. For these monsters are not dissimilar to the bogeymen under her bed, that can now be vanquished because despite the struggle and the terror, the Fellowship of the Ring guarantees that good will win. And Tolkien is no longer a South African-born English writer, but an alchemist that makes meaning out of human chaos, and he also belongs to this child, to her family, to Kenya. Should it matter? Has she lost her connection with her community, her language, her world, her identity by laying claim to Tolkien? What if she included Tagore among her people? Does it become more acceptable? Why? Who says so? Is world literature then possibly the literature produced in all the world? I should hope so. For it is inspired by the experiences of and in response to that which the world rouses. Unless, of course, there are Martians and Plutonians here who have a different position. And if they are, I would love to hear from them. Yet, even in this discussion, deep and profound questions that bounce off that fundamental question I first asked, what it means to be human and where we seek for those answers, do point to the covert sustenance of a cultural specific human pathology that to this day dares not speak its name. The reality of the extended and always morphing life of coloniality existing in a dominant historical framework that informs the state of the world and its choices today, including its choices of literature. Perhaps given the state of the world today and the real threat of an Armageddon caused by the abysmal stupidity of men who should really have been exposed to canonical literature at the least, perhaps it is in the real reckoning with this fact, that the answers that might engender, with the fact of world literature, that the answers that might engender a better kind of humanity are desperately sought, another lexicon of being human desired. In this, perhaps, does the role and place of the literatures of the world suddenly acquire prominence, as it does today. I wanted to talk very quickly about a Swahili epic, Utendi wa Tambuki, written in Pate Island, sitting in the German archives now. It has been the subject of some debate about ownership, authorship, and categorizing. First, because it is a creative retelling of a battle that took place in Tambuk, a place that is now in Saudi Arabia. And second, because of the choice of the writing system it used to tell a very Swahili story, the Arabic script. And third, it had everything to do with the sophistication of its telling, its aesthetic, its philosophical orientation, the details of which I shall not go into now. But the debate, taking place mostly in the Western Academy, as you can imagine, revolves mostly about its positioning, its ownership, the authenticity of its author, its agency, and it's the desire that it should sit, if it cannot sit in the Persian literary canon, it must sit in the Arabic canon, but it cannot and must not be African. What I wanted to point out, and I'm not going to go into all that stuff, but what I want to point out is that I'm not sure that we as a race and as a species have been able to extract our souls and mind from the violence and actually, quite frankly, the stupidity of what Wole Soyinka references as the great philosophical minds of Europe, the Humes, the Hegels, and the Kants of this world, who used their talents to separate species into those with souls and agencies and those with none, founded on the convenient theory that some people are human and some were not. And those who are not human are not capable of imagining any form of literature. And which literature, if it is found, yeah, she put it very politely. She said it is likely to come from Mars. But in our consideration, I hope perhaps we can give a little thought in asking what is the underpinning criteria, the human criteria, the philosophical criteria that enables the categorizing of some literature as world and others as canon, and who decides and how and why? What is co-opted and what isn't? Yes. A very quick shift now. Yes. More John O'Donoghue. Words are the oblique mirrors that hold your thoughts. You gaze into these word mirrors and catch glimpses of meaning, belonging, and shelter. So does the human gaze have a specific language through which to recognize what it experiences? Does the yearning to connect and know quibble over the language of the delivery of that which it seeks? I don't know. I would imagine that there might be an excitement in the idea of insights into worlds that inhabit the world, and in all assorted voices told in a babble of ways, many accessed through translations or mitigated through the predominant vehicle in this time and age of English, and whether we admit it or not, Englishes. Englishes, that is not a mistake. Marlon James, BBC Nigerian Pidgin Service. The resilience of a language is invested in its capacity to pimp itself and spread wide open to become all things to all peoples. It opens itself to become Creole or Pidgin. And even that version of English you people here call US English, for example. It seems to have learned how not to go the way of Latin or calcify in the way that French, once the dominant linguistic standard, did. Yet it is fraught with so much baggage and has been the means through which so much wickedness has been conveyed. And yet here it still is. And even those who object to its omnipresence in the literature of the world, like my beloved sage Ngugi wa Thiong'o, or even Wole Soyinka, still detail their protestations in erudite English. What do we do? The late Chinua Achebe, in a 1965 essay titled The African Writer and the English Language, invited writers, particularly those emerging out of the post-colonial milieu, to aim at, and I quote, fashioning out an English which is at once universal and able to carry his particular experience. He noted that carrying the weight of African experiences required a new English, still in full communion with its ancestral home, but altered to suit its new African surroundings. In his 1975 essay, Colonialist Criticism, Achebe proclaimed and warned, "Let no one be fooled by the fact that we may write in English, for we intend to do unheard of things with it." This is what we do, among other things. In 2014, Jalada, a Pan-African, but more accurately, a postmodern pan-global writers collective operating from Nairobi, produced its language issue, which caused all sorts of ripples. They took Ngugi's story, The Upright Revolution, and got writers from the African continent to translate it, and writers from the other parts of the world got into the act. So far, it has been rewritten in 65 different languages of the world. I'm not entirely sure what all this means or what a new generation of players at the literary frontiers intend, but it is all rather exciting and complicating to the imagination of worlds, words, and English, and story. Long live our ceaseless quest in making sense of being. Thank you.
Jeremy. Go ahead, Jeremy. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be back here, and I'm really pleased to be able to help celebrate the 50th anniversary of the IWP, an institution to which I owe a great deal. I arrived here 6 years ago with a vague sense that I might be a writer or someone who'd scammed a free holiday. Why not? But after seeing the collisions of so many voices from so many parts of the world, I began the enterprise of literary translation in earnest and have been doing that ever since. So this place has literally transformed me, and it's wonderful to be back. If you go to a library in Singapore, you'll be confronted with a sea of books marked fiction, then a sad, separate shelf marked Singaporean fiction. Usually off to one side and sometimes on a different floor altogether. And that's just for books in English. Singapore's other 3 official languages are tucked further out of sight, with the local Tamil section being all but invisible. The library authorities would no doubt claim this is done to highlight local literature, and yet I can't help but hear a derogatory tone in that word local, and can only read this positioning as a form of self-marginalization in which there is literature and Singaporean literature. The metrics are different in centers of power, of course, and in this country the distinction is often between American and world literature. But it seems to me the reason certain writers in America are comfortable placing themselves outside the corpus of world literature is that they perceive their work to transcend the world, reaching for the universal. I occupy a somewhat schizophrenic position within the context of world literature. On one hand, I am an Anglophone writer from Singapore who writes about Singapore, a country the literary establishment, however defined, is largely indifferent to. It's hard not to be aware of how tilted the scales are at an international level. When one looks at the annual Singapore Writers' Festival's marquee names, almost always non-Singaporean, and has to witness the spectacle of Jonathan Latham in the middle of a panel, turning to Singapore's most prominent Chinese language author and asking, "So, what is it you write?" Or indeed, a year later, Jonathan Latham publishing a novel partly set in Singapore, committing such fundamental errors that I'm certain no Singaporean ever set eyes on the manuscript, presumably because he felt his 3 days in the country gave him sufficient authority that there was no need for fact-checking. On the other hand, I live in Brooklyn, the birthplace of Jonathan Latham. And I translate into English, which gives me a disproportionate amount of power. I recoil from the idea of being any kind of gatekeeper, but I have had Chinese language writers press their books into my hands. Take this to the Americans. And it is true, despite my vast insignificance in the Anglophone world of letters, The fact that I have any kind of foothold in that sphere gives me an outsized amount of influence. English language publication is often the gateway to other languages, what's known as a bridge translation, as well as to major awards, to film deals, to all kinds of glittering riches. Now, I certainly don't mean to disparage writers who seek recognition from the West. Some of this stems from simple pragmatism, a response to the commercial fact that white people buy so very many books. But there is also a larger current I observe in many Singaporeans, myself included. Our national newspaper, the Straits Times, regularly runs features on Singaporeans who have made it abroad, mostly in the West, novels finding a British or American publisher. And when I find in myself a craven longing for approval from the center, I am responding to childhood conditioning, to a process of colonization that wants to locate the center of my culture somewhere else. For those of us in that position, every move becomes a cultural gap to be navigated, and it can be impossible to act without second guessing. Looking at the description of today's panel, is globalization changing what and how we read? I have to ask, who is we? But not really, because I know. Because the accretion of power is most visible to those of us on the periphery. And the further one is from the center of cultural capital, the more acutely one feels like a character in the Hunger Games, clamoring to be picked from amongst the many in one's corner of the world, to be brought as a tribune before the oddly dressed folk on the podium, with Elizabeth Banks as Machiko Kakutoni and Stanley Tucci as the Man Booker jury. When I tell people here I'm a novelist from Singapore, their reaction is often to tell me how much they enjoyed Crazy Rich Asians, to which I respond with a wordless howl of anguish. Kevin Kwan doesn't speak for me, I protest, which is an odd thing to have to say, because Kevin Kwan isn't trying to speak for me. Kevin Kwan, like many of us, is trying to ply his art and earn a buck. And yet, Singapore is so little represented outside its borders that it's hard not to take it personally when a prominent portrayal comes along that one disagrees with. But the person who enjoyed Crazy Rich Asians just wants a breezy summer read with an exotic setting. Well, I want equitable representation and a leveling of global power structures. And isn't it sad that these wants are incompatible? As for the question of what literary writing is falling between the cracks, the only possible answer is, how on earth would I know? As a relatively privileged global citizen, I am as much enthralled to the idea of the canon as anyone else, even if my position to it is one of resistance. In my work as an editor at the Asian American Writers Workshop, I have on occasion worked with marginalized voices, such as certain Cambodian writers, and yet I'm only able to reach people when I know someone who can put me in touch with them. And removed from the support structures of hegemony, these writers need a lot more work, absent craft, editing, or competent translation, to produce something publishable. And even as I put in this labor, I worry that my definition of publishable is shaped by Western norms, and that in drawing these artists fractionally closer to the center, I am becoming complicit in shoring up that center. When faced with monolithic power, one has the choice of attempting to dismantle it from the outside, almost certainly a futile enterprise, or seeking admission in the form of token representation. It would be disingenuous to suggest that what is admitted into world literature has no impact on global cultural production, nor that what we read is largely determined by what is placed before us. I have no answer as to how to democratize this state of affairs, nor how to elevate voices of the margins without co-opting them. But asking the question is surely a first step, and one that feels more urgent than ever in today's world. Thank you.
Peter, you want to stand up, I believe, so I'll let you move. Oh, no, you don't have to move. No, I said we'll let you move. I'll move round so I can see you.
My presentation is called Butterfly Wrapping. I first became aware of Yvonne Vera when her publisher, Moyaz Vasanji, sent me her first book, Why Don't You Carve Other Animals? Moyaz Vasanji was in the IWP in 1989, and we launched his novel, his first novel, The Gunny Sack, at Prairie Lights bookstore, and I taught it in my African literature class. Mary Gravett, sitting there, was in that class, and Moyaz breathed a sigh of relief when she really liked the novel. So I found in her interlinked stories a blend of precision language, which made us see scenes clearly, and poetic language, which made us hear in many ways different from what we were used to. She opened up the gateways of perception, leaving us to puzzle through our feelings and thoughts. I discovered that she, and now I should mention she was, of course, in Canada, but she was from Zimbabwe. I discovered that she had sent her first story to Moyaz, who was the founder and editor of the Toronto South Asian Review. He published it, asking her if she had more stories. She said she had, and then she started writing the stories and sent him the manuscript, which he published. I began teaching her book the following year, 1994, in my course on African literature. The students loved it. A few months later, Moyaz sent me Yvonne's first novel. I received it just before I was to leave for Toronto to visit my mother, so I finished reading it in the city of its publication on June 27, 1995. I then phoned Moyaz's wife, Nurjahan Aziz, and told her I would like to meet the author. She arranged for us to meet at the Vasanji house just off a Yonge Street on June 30th, 1995. Yvonne Vera told me that she would like us to go to a nearby coffee shop on Yonge Street. Uh-oh, I thought. She wants to check me out in a neutral zone. While having coffee, I asked her if I could turn on the tape recorder. She agreed. I began by saying I felt Nehanda was metaphysical and spiritual. She replied that metaphysical and spiritual forces had led to the independence of Zimbabwe in the first place. I quote her now. For me, it seems a betrayal of the centrality of the spiritual force, if in fact after independence we are going to forget the presence of that spirit, she said. Nehanda was certainly in the first phase of the struggle, she continued, but she was also in the second phase in the 1970s, which led to independence in 1980. The second phase was made possible because of the ability of people to have recourse to the first struggle, which was led by Nehanda. She said, the main phrase that led to the second struggle was the spirit asked us to do this. That was the main justification for it, that Nehanda said, we must do this. So it was out of loyalty that the songs that surrounded the revolutionary struggle gave freedom fighters the belief that they could survive. That is why the young people could join the freedom fighters, because they believed they would not be harmed. So right up to the day of independence, the Prime Minister had that photo excuse me, of Nehanda behind him. I'm still quoting Yvonne, Vera, not. I did not hear anything about, I did not know anything about Nehanda as a real person. Yvonne explained, after the British had been there for 2 to 3 years, they looked for her, they chased her, they found her, and she was tried in a British court, she was found guilty, and she was hanged along with the Kaguvi spirit, which I also mention in my novel. She was first of all a historical figure. In the written story of the European text, there are photographs of her before she was hanged. But the kind of history I was trying to write, a history that goes beyond the particular day of April 27, 1897, that the British record. I choose to reject the event of that history of her being hanged. I was trying to free her from that photographing space in which I first encountered her. It had been an intrusion on her. She did not seem to belong to that space. That space actually incorporates a series of spaces: the photograph, the book, the school, the educational system that taught history a certain way, colonialism, and so on. I asked Yvonne when and how she wrote the novel. I wrote it in 1992, she said. It came to me. I believe in some spirituality. It was truly a visit. When Why Don't You Carve Other Animals came out, the person I saw on the evening of that launch was Wole Soyinka. Soyinka was the only person from Africa she met. Remember, this was in Toronto. He was giving a talk at the University of Toronto. I told him I was going to launch my book. He wrote some greetings for me in my book, the first text I had received. It simply felt wonderful that he was an ancestor, a very spiritual man. I felt as though my ancestors had not abandoned me. She added that she did not understand what her book was about until Soyinka acknowledged it, because she explained, you need a context for your work that speaks to you in a meaningful way. The opening chapter of the novel Nehanda was an invocation calling for the spirit. And this is where I'll read that opening chapter. Ants pull carcasses into a hole, and she is not surprised. Pain shears the lines on her palms, and she turns her eyes to her hands in wonder. Rivers and trees cover her palms. The trees are lifeless and the rivers dry. Anthills move in dying, elongated shadows, while furious red clouds escape, swirl upward, thin into a haze. Grass trembles with the wind, while ants vanish into the ground over her waiting palms. Nehanda carries a bag of words in a pouch that lies tied around her waist. She wears some along her arms, words and bones. Words fall into dreaming, into night. She hears the bones fall in the silence. She is surrounded by a turmoil of echoes which ascends night and day. In the morning, a horizon of rock, of dry bones, grows into day. Nehanda waits in the silence. Her throat is parched like the barren land. The wind has written the soil, flung it into the horizon. The grass has been forgotten by the rain. Water gathers in her eyes, which have been filled with dark, heavy clouds, and it is as though it has rained. A storm breaks, and the ground beneath her trembles mercilessly. The wind carries clouds of broken leaves to the waiting horizon. She feels a gaping wound everywhere. The wound has been shifting all over her body, and she can no longer find it. She raises her hands above her head as though supporting a falling roof. She gestures into the sky with frantic arms. She laughs. The skin tears away from her, and she knows that the damage to herself is now irreversible. Nothing will save her from this final crimson of death. It is too much like her inner self. That's the opening, and compare this to the opening of her first story, which was published in the Toronto South Asian Review. It's called Astral Lynx. They drove through the city in silence, stopping at the traffic lights and watching the people cross the street. Women in high heels looked around at the cars as though not trusting them to stop. A blind man cast his stick back and forth ahead of him, sending those in his path skipping to a safe distance. When he reached the other side of the street, he sat down and extended his cupped hands. So you can see the difference in the writing. I did not know, she says this, I did not know whether Nehanda would come as far as Canada from Zimbabwe or Africa, but she did. And I wrote after she visited, I certainly believed in that. I believe in that she did. I felt quite old after the myth I had to go into. For me, the myth is the history, and I don't apologize for looking at myth as history. History should have flexibility. We can refashion myth to suit whatever catastrophe has fallen us. We can reinvent our realities. Nehanda challenges the kinds of histories that have come down to us, the kind of constructions politically that are outside that spiritual world, that trivialize our history. When history is seen as buried in the text rather than in the mouths of people, something is wrong with it. She acknowledged that it might seem like a contradiction, that she challenges the text within another text, but she had also presented different voices in the novel. She said she had found voice in Ngugi's Matigari, just as in Gabriel Okara's The Voice. How could, she said, how could the authorities imprison a voice? It was impossible, she said. Yet she went on to say female voices, that is, the responses of women to the strangers coming in, were absent in many of the early African novels. Yvonne had written a PhD dissertation on the prison literature of Africa. She said that in a way, Nehanda was also prison literature. The first narrative to come out of Zimbabwe, Rhodesia then, was Nehanda, because the last words she said, or which she believed, she said, were, "My bones will rise." And she said it's a short narrative. She mentioned a work by Chengarai Hove, the book Bones. And I said, yeah, I said, I wrote a review of it for Heinemann. History is in our mouths, she said. She agreed the two texts were similar. History is in our mouths. I played devil's advocate, pointing out that people might argue that the oral could not lead to the truth. She replied she was not concerned about the truth, because then people fought over what the truth was. She was concerned about many truths. After I returned to Iowa, I taught her two books in my course. I suggested to my classes that we imagine the first volume of stories to be encircled wagons, the spaces between which permitted us to enter, and once we got through to the center, we found Nehanda, which was the political, spiritual, and metaphysical matrix. When the first book became unavailable a few years later, I believed that it had served its purpose, namely to lead us to Nehanda. Many students chose to write on the following question. This is one of my questions for the students. While Nehanda is based on a real-life woman who was executed by the colonizers for her political actions, what we experience is the spirit of Africa seeking transformation through the power of words. Discuss. A lot of students wrote about this. And to my surprise, the students loved this. There was Craig Hasegawa, who took my class in the fall of '95, and he told me that Nehanda helped him to resolve his problems of identity. He was Hawaiian, his mother being white American, his father being Japanese. He loved Vera's work so much that he got in touch with me 3 years later to inform me that he had reviewed her third novel, Butterfly Burning, from which I get my title. So, finally, I just got tired of reading essays on Nehanda that tried to be as spiritually creative as the novel without paying much attention to its political and aesthetic dimensions. So I decided to stop, and then Sandy Barkan phoned me and said that Yvonne Vera, had passed. Just the semester I did not teach it. And so I decided I had to say something to the class. I spoke about Yvonne Vera's fiction in class the day after I got that news. I decided to pass around Yvonne's books so students could see them, hold them, and sense them. I also decided to show a photo of Yvonne and me because I wrote to Jamila Siddiqui in London. She has a novel, which I can show some of you afterwards, about the Asian expulsion from Uganda. When I read that novel, we have communicated ever since then through email. And so I sent a description to Jamila in London, and I said, I said to Jamila, I had decided to take the photo of Yvonne Vera and me to class yesterday, but I could not move it from the stand. The stand had, and since Jeremy has offered to help us celebrate this, I got your words, I heard him, I was next to you. Please open that container next to you and hold it up, and hold it up appropriately. So this is what I said. In the frames were two photos, one of Yvonne and me taken by Moyes, and the other of Moyes and me taken by Yvonne. It was like a double cross. So I asked a student who was in my office to help me carry it to the class. Now I'm Jeremy. I held it up and told the class that I felt like a priest. I then left it on the desk, which you may, while teaching the class. I did not realize till later that in our photo, Yvonne and I was sharing ice cream from a cup that was between us on the table. That's what I wrote to Jamila. And Jamila replied to me, yes, a priestly gesture, Jamila said. So, you have both drunk from the same cup, if ice cream can be drunk. How poignant. And now, I went back, Yvonne, so I'm summing it up now. Yvonne Vera's novels are like dreams. Dreams can override the barriers people put up between themselves and others. Nehanda was like Bessie Head's Maru. Bessie Head was in the program in 1977. Like Bessie Head's Maru. Yvonne recalled Molika saying to Margaret, once there was one of you, now there are two of you. Not quoting the lines like a scholar, but conjuring them up like a creator. It was that generous. Was Yvonne. I told her that Ishmael Reed once said to me that if people did not want to read his novel Mumbo Jumbo, it was all right. They could just buy the novel and use it as a door stopper, and that would have its effect. The tape recorder was full of a full-blooded laughter. I liked that, she said. But she also wanted people to read her work. Still, she added, she was now known by people who had not read her work, and her name was thus an inspiration to young writers in Zimbabwe. She signed her copy of the novel. Here it is. She signed it to me. For Peter Nazareth, remember, we have tongues with which to dream. Yvonne Vera, Toronto, Timothy, etc. She liked the taste of ice cream on her tongue, I remember. That's it.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everybody here. inevitably, when we talk about world literature and we have writers from various parts of the world, we find that we have, as the Italians say, molta carne sul fuoco, lots and perhaps sometimes too much to talk about, in the sense that all these talks are coming from very different positions, and so we find ourselves muddled, and we find as we find in a bookshop that genuinely has everything, that one could see why someone sometimes wants to separate things out, just to orientate, if we can use that word, ourselves. I want to throw in as moderator, to try and give a bit of clarity to a debate, if we can, just a couple of kind of question ideas. Community and writers existing and addressing a world in which they live and they know. Does that make sense anymore, the idea that the writer grows up in a community and addresses problems, or not problems, but simply life, expresses life in that community and to a certain extent for it? And will that, if it's excellently done, necessarily be universal in its attraction, necessarily be available for translation everywhere? I remember an encounter from the director at the time, I don't recall the lady's name, of the Edinburgh Festival. I was complimenting her on the wide range of authors she had, and she said, I believe if a book is good, it will reach out to everyone. Obviously, this very fortunately fits in with a monetization, if we can use that unpleasant word, of literature, in the sense of it reaches out to everyone. We can also sell it to everyone. My own feeling is that I do know a number of English books that I'm very attached to that I suspect do not do that. But I don't want to talk about me and my tastes. I want to ask the question. Jeremy talked rather disconcertingly about Chinese authors who come to him, my book has to get into the Anglophone space. As someone who's spent now more than 30 years in Italy, this is a constant request to me. How can it's not enough for me to be an Italian author. This book has to get into the world space. If one goes to a country like Holland, one finds that writers will say, I simply can't make ends meet if the book doesn't. So the question is, how do we feel about this, and do we agree, and what do we think? I don't know. Yvonne, do you want to say something?
Forgive me, I'm a pragmatist, quite frankly. The books go where the audiences are, and the current reality, the lived reality is, I guess that's just the way it is. But that doesn't mean the work is not accessed in other ways. There's so many ways of accessing a text. But I don't know, I'm not sure I can fully answer yours, that particular question.
I don't think we have to fully answer anything.
Okay. I think very practically, the way it's structured, the way the literary universe is structured right now, the Anglophone world holds the greatest amount of readers, those who are willing to pay for it and willing to give writers a chance at living as a writer.
I mean, I just want to say as a counterpoint that there are certain regions, for instance, Latin America, where it can be an article of pride not to be translated into English as a form of resistance. When I was here at the IWP, I asked the Argentinian writer how I could read her novel, which sounded fascinating, and I'll never forget the glee with which she turned to me and said, "You can't."
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, can I say this is also, there is clearly a polarization occurring amongst writers. For example, in Italy, which I've just spoken about, Italian poets have a very strong tradition in dialect poetry, which is, for example, there is a colleague of mine, Eduardo Ducato, who's one of the prominent dialect poets in the Milanese dialect, and despite my 30 years in Italy, I cannot really read this poetry, and but he does put an Italian translation alongside. So, but there is, as you say, a polarization between people who say, I don't want to go to that space, and others who do. But,
yeah, thanks. I was just going to say that I think, to go back to my own experience in the Caribbean, where local was not encouraged, I found that places throughout the Caribbean, like in Guyana in the 1970s, a lot of what you call world writing, sometimes a lot of it is tied to national struggle, political movements. And like in Guyana, they were having a sort of socialist experiment in the 70s. And they were big on publishing their own books. So you had all sorts of really creative, wonderful local things where people would, publish a book, handwrite them and find. And that way the work got out. I think more and more, certainly with people can, Derek Walcott once said to me that everybody can publish a book now. I don't see it as a problem because people have these desktop things where they can turn out things that look like any publisher publish them.
Absolutely, better.
So I suspect if you really want to get your book out there, it's not as much a problem as it used to be. Does that make any sense to you? But I just want to say this before you don't ask me, before I don't get to speak again, is that
you can speak.
No, I'm not. No, it's not a criticism of you. I'm just the time. What was the most amazing? I was thinking that in the dead of night, it occurred to me that when I was here in 1983, the Berlin Wall had not come down. There was nothing called, the Iron Curtain was still up. It hadn't collapsed under its own weight. The Arab Spring had not happened. All these things, and yet the IWP managed to house the entire world between the walls of the Mayflower, because there were writers from all of these places there. And it was, I don't know if that's happened. Well, it can't happen again because those set of circumstances no longer exist. But I think for any writer to have been a part of something like that, where we would notice, for example, there was a Chinese writer who never stayed inside. He got up as early as he could and he stayed in. Do you remember him? Because he had been in prison for 10 years because of something he wrote. So he could not bear to be inside. And we all just loved the fact that he was just always outside. But I came to know the world from this perspective. From the womb of the Mayflower, I was looking out. It was just the most amazing thing. And there are other stories too. But I'm just saying that it is just amazing that at that time, none of these things had taken place. Let's not have it. I'm going to shut up now.
We have 45 minutes, I think. There's no problem. Peter, the African authors you were talking about, does this question of writing towards an international audience or the community in which they grow up, or is there absolutely no problem there? Is there no tension? We do have we have actually 3 excellent questions from the public. This one's addressed to Jeremy, but we could start it off with Peter, and it's simply, if a writer wanted to avoid writing to the center, what should he or she consider? The question.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer in a short time. You can see I wouldn't be able to do it. So, but I remember Gugi Wathiongo and I were together at university. I was ahead of him, and then we were together at Leeds, and we discussed a lot of things together as fellow students and all that. And I was aware that he was increasingly feeling disgruntled that he wrote in English, whereas the people he thought he was writing about and he ought to be addressing, but they didn't know English. And he began, no, he didn't begin it, but he supported that movement of writing in African languages. And of course, as Yvonne will say, if she chooses to answer that has its problems too. But Gugi pursued it and eventually discovered the pronouncements come first, and then the practice is later, and then people say, oh yeah, you have contradicted yourself. But of course, writers can contradict themselves. What he began to do later was I should actually say that the first novel was written that he wrote in his mother tongue of Kikuyu, was when he was detained, and he wrote it on toilet paper. And then he's always asked that question, how could you write a novel in toilet paper? And he said, in detention, the toilet paper is not presented for your comfort, but it's really good for writing. So thereafter, so he tried both. He tried getting another translator to do it, and he himself did it. And then with the long novel, Wizard of the Crow, he seemed to have done it simultaneously. But by that time, I mean both English and Kikuyu, but by that time he had one advantage. Right up to then, he says he was writing in longhand with a pen and paper. Though I recall that when he was a student, he was the only one among us who was typing. But now, what happened was that an American student told him it was time he started using a computer, and he lent him a computer. It may have been a laptop, said, play with it. And Googie took off on it. And then the student gave him the bill to pay for it. And Googie wrote that Wizard of the Crow for the first time on a computer. That's why you can read it, even though it's 760 pages and really shortened from 1,200 pages to that. So that question of writing in languages keeps going on. What Yvonne does, Yvonne Vera does, is she uses English, and she uses Shona when she can, and other African languages too.
Can I just say one more? No, I'm sorry, I keep going back to 1983, I'm sorry. But the other amazing thing about 1983 was that Amos Tutuola was here. And I really wanted to say this before, that it was clearly one of the greatest things of my life to have met this man. And I think, again, I remember one of the very first events we had, he spoke, you remember? And people had come from all over just to engage with him. And I was amazed at how well-known his work was and what an influence his work has had. I look at, do you know there's a character on Law and Order who's called Amos Tutuola? Yes, apparently his work has had all sorts of, and I think it must be from it could have been from his time here. It was his first time in the United States of America. But speaking about, writing in other, the palm wine drinker, I'm sure that book has had, it would take Malcolm Gladwell to kind of figure out the influence that book has had on popular culture, certainly in this country and in other places. And that's written in Amos's language.
Uh-huh. In that connection, I'll say I took Tutuola to the bookstore, and Paul, who later worked for Prairie Lights, Paul said to him, he was in awe, and he said, Mr. Tutuola, I love your works. And Tutuola said, yeah, but I don't write in good English.
Yeah.
And then he laughed and said, but see how far I've got with my practice.
He was a bit of a trickster. Yes.
So the question was, how can one...
The question was, if the writers who come to you don't want to move towards the centre, if they don't want to get themselves at the centre of the Anglophone world, what do they do?
I mean, if you don't want to write to the centre, I think I have to borrow the works from my Argentinian colleague and say, you can't. Yeah. Because I've just come to accept that we're all fallen human beings. And the further we are from the centre, the more compromised we are, and the less possible it is to reach for some mythic purity or authenticity. I mean, a way to reframe that question is, how can one write as if the world was a fair place? Or in my case, how can one write as if colonialism didn't happen? And the only answer is that, but it's not a fair place, and it did happen. My parents were British subjects when they were born, and they still pride themselves on speaking the Queen's English. And I was raised on Enid Blyton and the BBC World Service. You can't undo all of that. All you can do is hold it present in your mind and be aware that that is an influence, rather than do what those in power seek to and assume it as the neutral position.
Okay, we have a question for Yvonne. It has been said that language speaks. How has the story, or the meaning of the story, your story, translated into 60-plus languages, changed in its many translations? That would be difficult for you to know for all 60 of them, I would imagine. Has it spoken differently in significant ways that you're aware of?
Okay. Actually, it wasn't my story, it was Ngugi's story. Oh, I wish my story would get it. I will let you know about that. I'd wax lyrical about all the 65 languages, I promise you that.
Sorry.
Well, actually, you can Google the story. It's on jalada.org, the story, The Upright Revolution, or Why Humans Walk Upright, the one that was translated into all those different languages. They published it online, and I think, strangely enough, it's the Spanish press that's producing a hard copy of the same. When I encountered the text, and you will see it if it's still accessible, I read the story in English and in the other language I grew up with, in Owuor. And the rest of the time, I looked at the other stories as a kind of aesthetic experience, just happy to see the words there and how they're arranged on the page and what they look like. And I couldn't pretend anymore, though I know I should rhapsodize and say, oh, wonderful, it's in Urdu, but I won't. It was there, it exists, and those who want to access it can access it in whichever way that pleases them. I don't know if that answers your question. Well, yes, but yes.
I suppose the question whether people are reading the same text when they read the translated text is an ancient question and largely unanswerable. And because we're all different to a degree, I suppose we all read a different text since we bring a different context. Let's turn to this fascinating question that's been asked, which is for everybody who's been here at the Writers' Centre. It says, as mentioned at the start of this panel, Manzoni claimed that the fun goes out of the conversation when speakers are expected to speak the hegemonic. I'm not even really sure how to pronounce that word. That is one of the effects of living in Italy, is that they accent the words differently, so I'm not sure, hegemonic or hegemonic language. During your time at the IWP, what characteristics, this is interesting, do you believe were removed from your personal expression or dialogue when speaking to those from varying cultures or national backgrounds? And how do you compensate for this loss or interpret these challenges? And how does this differ depending on your audience? Here you go.
Me again? No, I've spoken a lot.
You've spoken too much?
Yes.
I don't think you've spoken too much, Laura.
Well, I found a wonderful... you know what I found? That every writer in the Mayflower loved Bob Marley.
Excellent.
So Bob Marley, we all had that in common, and I'm sure they don't understand most of what he's singing, but they all loved him and they understood him. So, you know, like good poetry, it communicates before you fully understand what he's saying, you know. I found that writers belong to some kind of a lodge. Most writers, you know, are, you know, they like the same things. They're usually the weird ones in their family, things like that, you know. So you could always find common areas there. I just, you know, yeah. It's true.
Yeah.
Jeremy, any reflections on this?
There was actually quite a lot of people in Maya who spoke and wrote in English, which is an interesting direction for the program. But at the same time, we embraced our linguistic diversity-ish, by which I mean there were certain factions, such as the 4 Chinese language writers, and we would go off and have secret dinners, and that was great. But also, communication never really seemed to be a problem. I would say because when you're sufficiently drunk, everyone speaks the same language. I can't tell you how we communicated, but I can tell you that we did.
Yeah.
So no nostalgia at all for, I mean, at home, what language do you speak when you're at home in Singapore?
Oh, God.
No, but, no, but
You don't speak English, do you?
Oh no, a fellow Singaporean has outed me as being insufficiently authentic.
Actually, you speak English, can or not?
I can lah, but also must know how to code switch, right?
Excellent. But is it a relief when you get, is it like getting on an old raincoat with old bus tickets in the pocket and you think, fantastic, I can relax with this? Or?
No, not at all.
No, not at all.
I mean, I would say I'm equally, it's just about being dressed right for each occasion. It's not like one set of clothes is more comfortable than another. I'm altering.
I love that image.
Yeah, well, that's the return to London, you know, the old raincoat, the old bus ticket.
Yes.
So somebody provocatively asks, isn't the next logical step to hope to be translated into Chinese?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I don't, yeah. Yvonne says yes, please. Yes.
Okay, reality check.
I've had stuff translated.
Books in China cost about 25 yuan, which is less than $5.
Yeah.
So it's quite hard to turn a profit. And also, for whatever reason, most of them make their way online, and there seems no way to enforce intellectual property.
That's an excellent answer. I think we should remember that writers' income depends on the rule of law being enforced in the area of royalties. So although writers may be revolutionary over some aspects, they will always, I would suppose, uphold the rule of law in collecting royalties. We have a question that I'm not sure I understand, but it's been put in my hand, and I'm going to... It says, because, and I think it is this many, because many, or perhaps this is irony, because Americans don't study geography. Can this be true of this country? Can this be true? Because Americans don't study geography, world literature does not exist. What an interesting concept. Yet. And then it says Pearson's NCS owns Longman Publication, which I suspect, are we referring here to anthologies of world literature, the famous Longman's Anthology of World Literature? What can we do with this question? I think, I suppose what's being said here is that if you pick up the book, you really have no idea where it's coming from anyway. You read it, and you read it absolutely outside its context, and it may speak to you anyway, but clearly would speak very differently to somebody who was aware of the context. Peter, you have any feelings about this?
Actually,
Americans who don't know geography.
Goans, that's my ethnicity, are cultural brokers. They take from here to there and add here and there, and in fact we're sort of early on the scene in doing this because everybody does it. Languages talk to one another, so it's not a simple thing to answer, but it is a simple thing to live. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm not sure. Oh, okay, yeah, excellent. Let's have the explanation.
Americans don't study geography, so that we don't know there's a world outside of us and our culture.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, like what's that? I think, therefore I am. So if you don't know that anything exists out of your little small world, then nothing exists. Because when Chinua Achebe went to, was it Cambridge or over there to teach African literature, they put him in the anthropology department because African literature did not exist. And when you think about Pearson's, that's located right here in Iowa City, that owns Longman, but it still doesn't matter, even though it owns that international press. It doesn't matter because the rest of the world doesn't exist. And Pearson is very important because Pearson determines whether you can get into graduate school. I don't know how far out, but if you want to go to graduate school, they do the TOEFL, the TEFL, and everything else. So Pearson, it used to be NCS, now it's Pearson. So it's a very important company, and Iowa City is very important to literature.
Pearson's is very important in Italy. It has a very dominant position in the educational books market. One question that I would like to address before we close, Jeremy said an interesting thing which probably has occurred to all of us at some point, that power is most perceived at the periphery where it's something to resist or something that has to be accommodated or compromised with, and is not visible to those at the center of power who do not suffer from its exercise in any way. I'll just say here that, for example, in Italy, you go into a bookshop, 70% of the books there will be translated and from other countries, and 70% of those translations will be from Anglophone books, but and dominantly American books, so that one moves in a world where it's very clear that the center is elsewhere. If one imagines an American bookshop with 70% of the material published, I think it would genuinely shift perceptions about. So what do we think about that question? How do we react to that? Yvonne was no doubt pragmatic and says, deal with it. Any comment? Does one feel resentful? Does one, what? Let's finish with some reflection on this huge centrality of Englishness and even more Americanness. And at this moment, we are pretty much in the center of the USA. Yvonne.
Well, apart from the deal with it, I would also suggest that given the state of flux of things right now, and in some strange way, the opportunities that emerge with that state of both uncertainty, I imagine that there are new ways, new centers. The center is diffused. Certainly, having been here for 2 months, you get the sense that the center cannot hold. So that means if the center is moving, shifting in a lot of different directions, maybe also in the direction of Beijing, for example, perhaps I'm not sure whether the answers may necessarily be framed right now, but I suspect that something is emerging. A lot of other things are emerging, and a lot of centers, a lot of the diffusion of centers thing is also happening, and also mitigated and supported by the new technologies. Yeah,
absolutely. Mm-hmm. Does anybody else want to offer something to this, or do we?
Well, I'll just say, as you showed us with your quotes at the beginning, Tim, no culture or language ever enjoys a position of dominance for very long. So my advice is really to Americans and Anglophone writers, which is enjoy this while it lasts.
Yes. On that happy note, we'll close, we'll try and enjoy it. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you to all of the panel. Thank you.